So, hi folks. Thanks for joining us. I'm Yash. I'm your podcast host. Just a little quick introduction about me. I've got a background in journalism and marketing, and then I switched industries to pursue game art and specifically environment art. I have a passion for it. Much like some of the folks who might be watching us today, I am still learning, and I'm excited to talk to a lot of cool people in the industry and just learn alongside everyone else. And hope we can make this like a fun podcast for everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to just pop it in the chat and we'll get those questions answered. Today, we have Stefan Oprisan, who is a ex-senior material artist from Ubisoft joining us. Thanks for joining us, Stefan. If you would like to give us a small introduction.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm Stefan. I'm a freelance environment and material artist. I've actually done freelance for just over a year now. Before, like Yash said, I was at Ubisoft for 3 years on Avatar. So I've got about almost 8 years in the industry. The first game I worked on was actually Forza Horizon 4. That was a contract role at Playground straight out of university. Then I moved on to Frontier, worked on Planet Zoo, Elite Dangerous, and F1 Manager. And then I joined Ubisoft to work on most of those 3 years on Avatar, basically. And then since then, I've been basically taking on full-time mentorships at Vertex, think tank, and various other places alongside freelance. Yeah. So yeah.
That's really cool. That's very interesting. So could you just elaborate a little more on your journey to the game industry and how did you end up into like materials and texturing?
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I started in college in 2013 when I first got to experience a little bit of games development. They had a module which focused on CryEngine. So, that's another alternative for a game engine. And after doing that, I was just sort of so interested in doing that. And I just wanted to do something at university level. So I actually ended up doing games animation. But because all the other modules, games related like animation, art, level design, even, history, they were all doing the same modules. So everyone got to experience a bit of everything to give them a taste of what it's like. And there was actually a module that focused on environment art. So that kind of just caught my attention, just the aspect of, building environments, telling stories. I actually ended up switching to that. So actually it was a good thing that they give you the option to switch to that, which is quite handy. Um, and then in the second year, I got to do a summer internship funded by the university. There was a local studio that was funded also by the local community industry um, council and the university itself. So they kind of handpicked students from the university to work in the summer. So I got to do 6 weeks, which is fully funded, which is always nice to see. And that kind of gave me the first real experience of the industry, working in a small team, working with source control, and just trying to be more focused on the time management aspect, which is really good to see. So that kind of kickstarted the career, should you say, and then did my final year, finished the first class degree, and then went on to work as a contractor at Playground Games on Horizon 4 for a year. So yeah. After that, I worked at a smaller studio in between then until I kind of went to work properly at Frontier Developments. They were actually looking to hire for a 3D artist, but also a material artist. So I applied for both because I felt like, you know what, I think I've got the work for both. I didn't get the art role because I think they were looking for more someone who was more experienced in like making loads of sandbox type assets because of Planet Zoo.
Okay.
It's just like that kind of game. So, but they gave me the chance to sort of try out do the interview for the material art role, and then a week later they offered me the job. So yeah, it was quite handy because it just worked out in the end. And I think that kind of led me down the path of just focusing on material art for the next 6 years, basically, up until today. So, I've worked on almost half a dozen AAA titles just focusing on material art. So I kind of fell into that role. So I'm just continuing to improve the skill set, trying to experiment different ways. And I think that's something that I try and potentially push some of the students that I've got in my classes, or I try and recommend as an alternative way to specialize when it comes to environment art. So yeah.
That's quite the journey, and that's really interesting. I am so sorry to interrupt, but my screen has just entirely black. I just need a moment to fix. my
Yeah.
camera, and my laptop. I
I can see you fine though.
apologize. Oh, my entire screen, both my screens have gone completely black. I can't see
Oh,
anything. I apologize to the folks watching in. Please bear with me because tech, my tech really is wanting to act up today, which is not the day to be doing this. But okay. Um, can you still hear me?
yeah,
Am I
yeah,
still audible? Okay, cool.
yeah.
That's
All
great.
good.
Uh, Thanks for being patient with me, guys. So, carrying on. So, I want to ask, with regard to obviously when you started pursuing your journey into games, into and especially ending up becoming a material artist, the industry was obviously different at the time, and
Hmm.
um, we obviously had different things going on. With regard to how the industry is today and how people are approaching art today, to the people who aspire to be material artists, who are very into it,
Hmm.
but are perhaps slightly either apprehensive or perhaps feel, slightly intimidated about approaching it. What would you say to those people?
Well, I would say that they are right to say that the material discipline is a bit more of a steeper learning curve. Like from what I've seen, these past 4 years, pretty much every single student I've had, I've said they don't want to touch designer because it's just so complicated and so scary compared to learning Painter, which has a much more robust and simpler way of working. So I would say if you are wanting to pursue more a material art focus. I think one of the biggest advice is really I can give you, and this totally depends on how you are as an individual and how you learn. Personally, for me, when if I want to learn more materials, I like to just physically get the SBS file or the material of someone buying it or downloading it and just seeing how it works. If you are starting out, definitely recommend to get through the fundamentals of just how designer works. Like put yourself in the mindset of how does the actual logic of building material work? And this is something that I'll cover extensively in the designer course. So that's, I think, the first hurdle that you've got to fully understand before you make your first material. Because there's no point you saying, okay, I'm going to make a material, but then you don't know where to start, you don't know how the logic works. So I think you have to sort of first understand what's the fundamentals way of building material, what's the building blocks of making a texture. So you start off with just like in environment as well. You start off with the macro features, move on to the details, you start texturing it, you convert your height map to various different textures they're going to use for texturing, and then you do your roughness passes. So I think you have to basically build it along that way in different building blocks to get a full material that gives you everything that you need to understand. And I think once you do that, it's all about repeating the process on as many variety materials as you can. So if you are wanting to pursue that, try and do 5 unique materials like a brick, a sand, a concrete, a rock, and then I don't know, a grass, for example, because each one of those materials will have a slightly different way, or actually a very different way of how they are built. A grass and a brick, one's organic, one's man-made. So you'll require different ways of building the material entirely. So once you start to pick up those little tricks, okay, I'm going to build these bricks, with these kind of nodes, and I'm going to detail it with these little nodes. You're eventually going to build up an idea of how to build the next material that might be slightly similar. Like if you build a concrete tile on the floor versus something on the wall, they're different in style, but they'll probably share similarities in how they are built. So you'll be able to pick up and adapt from other materials or just adapt from what you've done beforehand that you can improve on. So I think that's one way to approach it. The other thing I think that is really, really important is the context of your materials in how you present them. I think the days where you just render them in marmoset on a simple sphere is, it's still there. I think it's still a valid way to present the material on its own, but I think the context of how it's meant to be used is equally, if not more important. Like you've got
That sounds great. Also, for people who might be slightly confused on what Stefan means when he says the course, he will be teaching a boot camp on substance designer where he'll be doing a deep dive. And you guys feel free to sign up for the wait list. I'll drop the link in the comment section or in the chat actually shortly. We do have questions coming in for you, so Danny wants to know, how does mastering Substance Designer help increase earning ability as a 3D artist, and which 3D artist does it help the most?
So can you repeat the first part of the question?
So he wants the first part is, how does mastering Substance Designer increase your earning ability?
Earning as in,
As in, like, yeah, I take it, as in a job.
so like how does it improve your chances of getting the job, I guess? I think
Yeah.
one way to look at it is, it depends on the kind of jobs you'll be applying. I think nevertheless, most places that I've worked at, they'll potentially have a dedicated material artist. But that can, when I was at Frontier on Planet Zoo, we had three of us because we were all split on different departments. So you can get an idea of the amount of work. Like on Avatar, it was just myself, and then later on I was joined by somebody else. So I think what advantage you can have is that you can potentially give a helping hand to that particular dedicated artist to help them on the project. So I think that way is a good opportunity for you to branch into different disciplines, expand your skill set. You might actually even enjoy it more than what you're currently doing. And that could be a potential avenue that you can direct yourself into. You can talk to your art lead and say, look, I've really enjoyed making materials. This is something that I can do further, in the next project or for the DLCs. And that could be like a happy little accident where you can just move into a different way. You could even this is actually a great way for when it comes to paid reviews. You'll be doing your core responsibilities, but then if you're doing extra work on different departments, you can say, look, I've been doing a lot of work on this side as well. I feel like this is going to warrant me potentially a higher percentage of the pay rise, or potentially, look, I want to become a senior. I think this is a good starting point for me to continue working upwards. So I think that's one way to look at it. It's not just a case of how is it going to sort of, yeah, obviously it's going to help you in the long run because you can have more of a tick box skill set on the application versus somebody who's just got prop making, for example. And I think on the second question, again, remind me just so I'm clear.
It is sorry, just a moment. Which 3D artist does it help the most to learn Substance Designer?
Um, I'm not sure I fully understand the questions. Like, who is it going to
So,
help the most if you're doing materials?
as in, yeah, like we have different artists, right? Like a prop artist, an
Hmm.
environment artist, character artist, texture artist. So, who would benefit the most
Oh,
from?
right. Okay. So I think it's probably going to be a mix of obviously yourself building the materials and actually using them in engine, but even more so the art team itself. So when I was an Avatar, there was the world team which I was part of, but there was also the storyline, the campaign team, basically. So quite often there'll be artists that were working on the entire world, but then there are artists working on the storyline. So quite often I would get different requests from both teams saying, "Hey, Stefan, I need this material for this particular level. Can you help me out?" That'll be for a particular mission. So I would try and help them out, build the material so that they can do their work afterwards. So that's one way. Because otherwise, if they didn't know the skill set of making textures, or they were just plainly doing it wrong, it would take time off schedule trying to fix it. So it's a bit of back and forth collaborating with the different departments to ensure that they had everything they needed to do their job to ensure that the game looked as best as possible. And then yeah, on the level art team, the more materials you can build for the level art team, the better they can set the world. So as they are building various different, safe houses or just different story elements, the more variety they have in materials, the better they can make the story of the game.
That's wonderful. I'm just gonna check real quick to in the chat to see if people have questions. Okay, so okay, Danny has some more questions. He's saying, so for someone who wants to be a character artist, it's good to know just as much as for an environment artist. So yeah, he's just asking if it's if you're wanting to be a character artist, is it equally as useful for you to know Substance Designer as much as it would be for a environment artist?
Yeah, I think so because there might be certain instances, depending on what you're doing for characters, where you might need to have a designer skill set in terms of building various different or unique sort of alphas or just simple tiling textures. Like if you're making something like a leather or a cracks or like wood or a specific effect that you know this character is so unique that it just needs it. You can typically would build that in designer. And I think another thing that I did quite a lot on Planet Zoo was build various tools for particular filters and effects for the art team. So they would have a particular concept that they need to make various props for, but they need a effect or a filter that just achieves it for them. So I would potentially supply the tiling texture, or they would have something that they can work with. But if there's a particular effect or just a filter that you can't do in Painter, you'd have to build it in Designer. So that would be something that would sort of collaborate to ensure, okay, what can we do to make that happen? So that would be something that I think would be quite beneficial to know. Because I think that's also quite good to showcase, a additional skill set in designer and how it can link to your main discipline.
Okay. So moving on to the next question, which would be you mentioned that you worked at Ubisoft. So what was your experience like working at Ubisoft in terms of like material pipelines?
So I worked on two different projects. The first one was in Anvil, the second one was in Snowdrop. And because they were both in-house, they both had their own unique sort of ways of approaching materials. But in a nutshell, it was pretty, you know, as simplified as you can think of. You make the textures, you'd import them into a directory where it'll be in the engine that would sometimes actually auto detect those textures, and it would bring up a simple UI panel where you can add compressions, what kind of textures there are. And it was quite cool because it's similar like Unreal, where if you import a normal map or like a mask, it would apply the correct compression. So it kind of saves that potential mistake that you potentially would forget to enable, which can throw things off in terms of visuals. So that was good to have. And then it was just a case of plugging and playing the textures into the materials and then just adding them to a database where you can use them later. So it's fairly simple once you did it once or twice, but it was just different because it was a brand new experience in terms of you're seeing different UXs, UI panels that you'd normally not see because they're all in-house engines. So you'd never really get to see except if it was like a GDC type thing where they would showcase a breakdown of something which we all know is GDC happening around the corner. Um, but yeah, it was pretty simple in terms of how you'd actually build it. So there's nothing overcomplicated that. No, some stuff like in one engine, there was the ability to place certain materials on like slope angles that would be automatically done for you. Whereas the other one, you'd have certain terrain features, almost like Gaia and Wall Crater, where you could pick up various different slope angles that you could sort of build the materials in like a designer style chain. So you could get the erosion maps from the terrain, the flow angles and all those, and you'd combine them through a node system directly in the engine like you do in Unreal or like in Designer. So there was a lot of similarities like, okay, I can see why they did like this. And if you know Designer, you'll have a much easier time understanding what's happening there. Because besides just terminology and just visuals of the UI and UX, it's basically the same under the hood. If anything, it's more limiting the engine because it's not a dedicated terrain package or texturing package. You just basically be assembling stuff. So the cool thing is that you could actually request different features, coming from designer. You could say, oh, this is a really cool thing, designer. Can we get it in the engine? Would it be able to be developed? And there was instances where I contributed to various different tools that actually benefited the system and the general workflow. But for the life of me, it's been so long I can't remember them. Yeah.
So, would I be correct in saying that given that you already had knowledge of working in designer, it was just a matter of working with the in-house engine and the in-house software is just a little bit to understand, just get used to the UI, because if you have your concepts down, if you understand how material is built, it should be fairly easy to transition to the in-house engine to in-house softwares that they use. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yeah, pretty much. It can't be any easier. Like you just have, material A, material B, and then you blend them with something together basically, and you just keep doing that in the chain until you can preview it in the editor. So it'd be as simple as that. And I think the main thing with knowing design and all these sort of workflows is that it speeds up your onboarding process. So, typically at Ubisoft, you'd have potentially like a 3 month onboarding. Some people do it faster, some people do it slower because, it's expected to know or to not know certain things, and that's perfectly fine. That's why they give you 3 months to learn everything. So when I onboarded, I started off. Well, to be fair, everyone starts off with a simple prop, like a small prop, medium prop, and then a complex prop. And as you go further up the chain, it will get more difficult and the workflows will be slightly different. The small one would just be a simple tileable in Painter, but you'd have to go through various different plugins and tools from Macs to export them, follow the collisions, follow the naming conventions to make sure that it imports properly. But then the more medium and the large prop would require you to think of tiling textures, vertex painting, splitting in certain way that would be more modular and beneficial to the performance of the engine and just general gameplay. So having these understandings already would help you because they're all going to be exactly the same wherever you go. It's just a case of it might be slightly different because of terminologies and just workflows and tooling, basically. But it's all exactly the same.
Okay. So, just wanted to go where you mentioned Substance Painter, just not too long ago. Um, what reason would you give? Like, what makes Substance Designer like a must-have tool for game artists? Like, there might be, let's just say, there might be people who would say, why should I learn Designer? I have Substance Painter. There's all the materials are like built in there, and I can just slap it onto like most of
Hmm.
my models. I can tinker around with the parameters to make it look all nice. So why should I be learning Substance Designer?
Well, I think for two main reasons is that Painter it can do more or less the same stuff as a designer, but in my experience, it's a bit more limiting because of the workflow. So with designer, you can build things however you want, whereas in terms of how you build your nodes, you can build a combination of nodes here, combine it at any point. Whereas with Painter, you're more limited with the anchor system and the linear stack, a bit like in Photoshop, basically. So you're literally limited on the vertical stack of layers. So you don't have as much flexibility in building things in a proper hierarchy. So that is one reason. The second reason is that all environments are going to require some form of tileable textures, whether they're interior or exterior, they're going to require you to make some tileable texture. And as much as you can do them in Painter, I do think you'd probably have a harder time achieving that effect. So you might say, well, I've got Megascans, I can just use, or even Substance Sampler, but Megascans doesn't have everything. So you'd have to eventually build something that matches exactly what you're trying to achieve. So depending on the type of concept or reference, or even the art direction of what you're given, you might have to go and think outside the box of building that directly in Designer. And there have been instances where, pretty much every project that I've worked on has allowed me to use Megascans, but I've still used Designer to just build on top of that. If anything, the Megascans would just be a foundation on like one single texture to act as a base that would build on top of that. So I do think Designer is, I'm probably biased saying this, but I do think it's essential in learning it.
Okay. So, going just backtracking a little to talking about working at Ubisoft. Now, it's a well-known company, massive AAA titles. That seems to be like the end goal, if not for all, at least for a lot of aspiring artists out
Hmm.
there. So your journey to Ubisoft, like what did you do, or like what tips would you give to people? Did you have to give an art test? What do AAA companies really look for when you apply to them, when you send in your portfolio? What should your portfolio really be having in order for them to even look at it?
Hmm. Well, I think from my personal experience, I think one of the most important things is to just have solid work. I think that's a given to try and have that. Um, if you are wanting to further increase your chances, is potentially to have something tailored to their one of their IPs. So depending on what kind of studio that you're applying to, you'd potentially want to try and match that style. So whether it's Assassin's Creed, Tom Clancy, um, what else is there? Yeah, well, anything like that Ubisoft related will potentially be something that you should tailor it because it's only going to increase your chances because they'll be able to see, okay, we can see that this person can do the art style of Tom Clancy or The Division or Assassin's Creed, depending on the thematic style of what it is. And if anything, yes, it might improve your chances, but it doesn't mean you'll be automatically ruled out for an artist. Quite often, what can happen is they'll just, you'll get 200, let's say, or 300 applications. Only 100 of those, if maybe even 75, will actually get the art test because they want to make sure that's the fair play on everyone to ensure that they can do it. But quite often, if you do have that particular environment that already has that really good work and it matches potentially one of their IPs, doesn't always have to, but it would definitely improve your chances. You potentially will skip that art test. And I think if you are just starting in the industry, you probably will have that art test, but there is a good chance that you potentially can skip it. Because some of the stuff you'll probably be asked anyway, whether it's in the art test or your own project, in terms of how you went about the the environment, how you've broken it down, what's your thinking process behind it, whether it's your own work or the artist. In my mind, I don't think it really matters. If anything, I would rather you ask you about your own personal work because you know more about it rather than something that you've just rushed in 2 weeks to get an artist, which I think could be quite limiting and it would just put a lot of pressure. So I think that's potentially one way to look at it, basically.
Okay, those are some really useful tips. I just want to contribute one point to that. That in order to get to the artist, this is just from my personal experience as a student who it was attempting to get into the games industry, land a job. This is tedious, but folks try and customize your resume for each and every single company, as tedious as and as exhausting as it sounds. There are a lot of companies who use AI, so they are going to scan through using AI. So if you don't have the keywords, it might just slip through it, you'll get rejected. So
Mm,
try doing that. I'm not saying that's going to guarantee you that, okay, you'll clear round one for sure and you're going to land the art test, but it will at least enhance your resume to an extent where they'll be like, okay, cool, has all the keywords. Then it'll actually go to a proper human who will be looking at it. So as tedious and as annoying as it sounds, it does seem to have some amount of effect. I'm just going to check the chat real quick for some questions coming in. All right, so do studios care about so Lily has a question. Do studios care about how you organize your graphs or just the results?
Well, I'm someone quite biased, and I'm quite OCD when it comes to that kind of stuff. So I would say yes, have very, very yes, because I've worked. So, when you would join as a material artist, could be at the beginning of a project, in the middle of production, or at the very end. So I've joined, projects at various different stages where I've had to build everything from scratch. And also through the process. And if it's just you, it can be very easy to just say, yeah, I don't care. I'm just going to build it because I haven't got time to make it clean or whatever. But eventually that person might burn out and they'll just leave or they'll be going to a different project. And that's where you'd come in. So if you have to pick up their work and you don't know where to start, it's only going to slow you down and make it more difficult to understand what do I need to do? What's my art director asked me to basically change? Okay. So I would highly encourage, and again, this is something that you'll gain the edge in my opinion, where if you are clean with your graphs, and we'll look in detail at if we have time at the demo, but you'll see this extensively in the course itself, how to be clean and concise with your work. And this is where you need to use the frames, you need to use comments. And this is something that I've recently started using is the portal nodes, where you can easily chain things along to remove these long spaghetti lines, because there's nothing worse, in my opinion, to open a graph, and it's so zoomed out that you can't even see the nodes, and you just see lines everywhere. Even for somebody who's, done this for years, it can still be daunting to be like, where do I start? And it's just a nightmare to work with. If anything, I personally would spend the first few hours just cleaning the graph, knowing that I'll come back several times to make adjustments or even to make revisions on it and make different variations to ensure that it's going to be clean. Because you never know who's going to be the next person who's going to come along and need to open the graph. So, do yourself a favor and just make sure it's nice and tidy. So
So
yeah,
you're being
if anything, yeah, sorry, if I did see someone who might have, really, really good work, but then they'll just be an absolute mess in terms of their organization. Quite often, if you're in a team, I might have to open your work because you're on holiday, you're sick, or you've left the company. So, that will probably, put me off if you don't have clean work, basically, versus somebody who doesn't have as good work, but is more organized. So, yeah.
That's a really good way to actually leave a very lasting impression because while you're there, you keep everything organized and neat and tidy. You're being very efficient with your work because if you have to go back in, it's super easy to navigate and find out what is where. But
Mm,
even if you're not there, if you have left it all organized, you're still efficient when you're not there because you left it like that. So the next person coming in, they are like, oh, this is all neat and clean. I can get started immediately. I can be efficient. I can be quick. So boom, 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 like work's getting done. So
yeah.
that's one really good way of leaving a very lasting impression.
Mm. And,
That would
and
probably circle back.
Yeah, and to add on that, one of the things that I did when I was at Ubisoft and Avatar is I built, because everything was just so messy, I ended up building documentation to tell exactly the person, well, to tell me, which texture is linked to which SPS file and to which subgraph. Like you'd find the different materials across one single SPS file, like one material, that'll be, it wouldn't make sense. So you'd have like five different types of, gravels or rocks or whatever to one single file when naturally that would be split independently in game. So that table that I built really helped me because I knew exactly which file I need to open and which graph I had to go in and change something. And then everything else I didn't care about. So I could just ignore. So again, yeah, build yourself concise documentation that's not just going to benefit you, the next person as well.
Yes, that's right. Oh, we have some more questions coming in. So Sebastian is asking, is Marmoset for props and is Marmoset for props and environment design needed to know? I am not sure. I completely follow. You can, Sebastian, feel free to correct me, but I take it you're asking uh if you need to know substance designer and can it link to Marmoset? I'm not sure I follow this. Is Marmoset for props and environment design needed to know?
Maybe as a general
Sebastian,
context.
I would say so. Yeah, if you can answer that, that would be great.
I mean, if you're just purely talking about presenting, if you're talking as the whole package marmoset, you can do a lot of stuff in there, like baking, presenting, and even texturing, of course. That's really good to use. But I think designer is so far ahead compared to everything else. Even the new Instamat that has been sort of making headlines for the last couple of years, that is still a bare bones soft. I mean, I've not used it, so I could be wrong, but it's still very bare bones. And designer and painter is so far ahead that nothing comes close to it. And I think again, it's all about hitting those limitations very, very quickly that would just potentially pull people off wanting to use it. So again, this goes back to actually Quixel Mixer. Like that was more of a passion thing when they first released. They've had a couple of versions, updates, and some new features. But since then, it's dead in the water. So because they've not been able to keep up with designer and painter, and potentially they've just moved on to other things. So yeah, I think it does have its benefits. Like it's really good for baking. If anything, it's probably better than baking than painter and designer. Certainly better than designer. But in terms of texturing, no, you want to use painter and designer, in my opinion.
Okay, I hope that gets the question answers. Uh, what are art tests usually like? That's I would say slightly on the broader end, but yes, what are art tests usually like?
So I'm going to answer this in the context of material art. So you'd probably be given a brief of a particular reference to work from, and you basically have to follow various different um, metrics, naming conventions, and just general terminology over what is the material going to be, basically. And you just have to go make it as close as possible. And really important, double read or triple read what is the actual requirement of you to deliver. Because there have been instances where people have just not read the brief properly and they've just rushed it and they've missed out something quite critical because they think, oh, I'm going to do it really quick to showcase that I can do things really fast. If anything, I'd rather have someone take it in exactly to the door of the end of the art test and deliver everything on schedule, exactly what's needed. So yeah, I think that's what I would say to that. And I think if you can, depending on, if you've signed an NDA, ask for some feedback. If you can post in various different Discord groups, um, maybe ask like a close friend who can keep things hush hush, just see what they think because it's always good to have another pair of eyes on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would recommend that. Just wanting to contribute to that point that, again, from my own personal experience for the artists I've given, um, this is slightly me going on a tangent, but before you actually do give the art test, just make sure you read through very well on what they want of you in terms of the art test, because I've had rather unfortunate experiences where there are people who will try to exploit. It's very sad that there are people who try to exploit artists and try and get some free materials, free props, some amount of free stuff. So just make sure you check on it because there will be certain giveaways on what's wrong with it. For example, if you open a Word doc that they've shared with you and there's like 20 people on it, that's there is an issue. You need to have some issue with that because that's not how a proper company would or a proper studio would conduct an art test. Um, we also have some more questions coming in. Hey Chams, thank you for your efforts. I hope you folks are enjoying. I hope you folks are finding this super interesting. How long do I need to learn Substance Designer? Considering I'm working on Macs from 2 decades, it feels so complicated.
Did you say Max or Max?
Max, I take it this person means 3ds Max.
Yeah. Um, well, like I said before, designer definitely has one of the steeper learning curves in terms of how you go about it. So I think the biggest hurdle is just trying to get the understanding of how the process works, the building blocks of making material. And then after that, once you've gone over that hurdle, it's just a case of making stuff, making as many things as you can to try and experiment with how you build up your understanding of, okay, this material needs this kind of stuff to be built, this material needs something else. And I think it depends on how you learn as an individual, like whether you learn best from tutorials or step by step, like just following it node by node, or even just finding different files online and just opening them. One great way that I've been doing over the last couple of years is if you have Substance Source, if you've got like an Adobe subscription, you can get the files from there. So you can get the Substance collection from like Daniel Tiger, um, Kyle, um, Don, and all of those people to actually see how the files are built. So you can almost like see how this little mini collection of, or this thematic scene has been built up. So you've got an idea. And that's always really good for me to see exactly, okay, they've used this effect here. What if I just rip it and just put it in my own work? How's that going to change things? What can I tweak about it? So if I was to say like a rough timeline in terms of building, well, learning designer, in context of like Vertex in terms of terms, I'd maybe say like a term. I'll probably say 2 solid terms of just purely focusing on this alongside various different environmental aspects would be enough, in my opinion, to build like a good foundation and a good array of different materials that you can say, yeah, I feel pretty confident to say that I can build all of these materials and then I can potentially build them into a small scene with mega scans or props or whatever to showcase them how they work. So I think as long as you've got the foundations of the other disciplines of just the environment art in general, modeling, UV mapping, baking, and just general texturing in Painter, and of course engine use, I think that will probably put you in a very good position. But I think it's one of those things where you kind of have to decide, what kind of avenue you want to go for, because there's only so many days, so many hours in the day that you can dedicate something to, that if you want to pursue working in the industry. Yes, you can take, as long as you want to learn and master that particular domain, but obviously you want to do it in a timely manner that you think, okay, in the next year, I'm gonna be ready to apply for something. So I need to do a clear breakdown of what I need to achieve and to do to hit that basically when I'm ready to apply for different jobs. So I think having a bit of an end goal is really good to have because it gives you something to drive towards and try and break it down into smaller stages so you can feel like you're making continuous progress, not just, a far end goal that's going to be, very, very difficult to achieve. You'll feel like an uphill battle.
Yes, that is really good. And just mentioning the bit where you were talking about like getting the materials that people who are already well established who know what they've done, like getting materials from those sources, studying how those materials are built, perhaps ripping them into shreds, trying to put it in your incorporating it in your own work. That is a really helpful tip, and I would say that is stealing like an artist.
Yeah,
So you
yeah,
learn
yeah,
better. So
yeah.
um, we have another question coming up. What's the best way to present your designer materials on your portfolio? Node graphs, material balls, in-engine renders, etc.
So this will just come down to preference, and I think also again the context of how you want to present things. So, typically I do like a flat plane, which is like a frontal projection. If you've seen my portfolio, you'll see that they're all pretty much identical in the consistency of how they're presented. They're either on a cylinder or like a sphere with a clear breakdown of the different maps with a clear render, and then you have a couple of beauty shots of them directly from designer. I do all of my renders directly from designer using the PBR render node purely because it's really high quality, the node. Obviously, it's a bit slower compared to real-time use in engine or Marmoset. I'll give it that, fair enough. But the consistency in quality that it gives you is just, there's nothing better in my opinion. Again, I'm probably saying because I'm biased, but um, I have all of my um, templates set up exactly that. I can just import the PBR node, add a HDR texture, and then I just need to tweak the displacement and just rotate the angle of the light. And that's it basically. I don't have to faff around with 3-point lighting rigs and any fancy post-processing. It just gives you instant results that are just super high quality. So I definitely highly recommend you try it out because it just will save you a lot of time. And also it'll save you money. If you just want to focus on presentation, and you don't want to spend 200 quid on Marmoset, then that's another way to go about it. But I think the other approach is to take things into the engine to showcase. Because again, if you're just taking stuff into the Marmoset or designer, that might not be enough. You might have to take it to the next step further to showcase how it's going to be lit in a rendering engine, because that's the end goal. We're making materials for video games, and they all go in video game engines. So even if it's Unity or CryEngine or Unreal or Godot, put something in an engine that's going to be showcased how it can be plugged in. And if you can do a demonstration of the material shader, a bit of the cameras, and just a simple framing of how it's all laid out, that's always good to see. So, you can definitely build it in a quite a complex way to showcase what kind of assets it's next to. So you can put a little character, which is going to give you proper scale. You can put him on a plane. You can use the default UE4, UE5 sphere, which is like the really fancy one, or you can just do a simple cylindrical plane render. That can also be enough. Um, does that cover everything? I think. Oh yeah, and
I
also like if you want to extend it, there's like showcase the graph breakdowns. Again, show me how clean your graph is. And if you've even just taking a full-on render is enough. But I think, yes, you can showcase that your graph is clean, but that's not really helping anyone. Why not just take a couple of close-up renders of like a couple of node combinations of how you did this part here, because it might just help someone. You might be able to give enough pieces of the puzzle that somebody can just take that and then make their own interpretation of what you've made. And they might even discover something else entirely different. And it's just going to help someone down the long run. I always try and recommend people do a breakdown because it will just help the next person who's struggling to make a rock or a grass, something like that. So it's always nice to, give something back.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I'm just gonna go over just a few more questions before we get into the live demo. So one thing that obviously we can't avoid is AI.
Mm.
So how do you see AI impacting material creation and um, what skills should material artists now be acquiring starting 2025? Because we now have AI, and there are obviously people who are starting to use AI for material creation.
Mm. Well, we've already seen some sort of headway with that kind of stuff in Substance Sampler. If you've not used that at all, they've recently done a feature where you can just type in text prompt and it will just give you a list of different references, and you can just do a simple click and import, and then it will do its AI tiling and all that kind of stuff, which is great for like product design. Somebody who has no idea in terms of the material production, which I think is great. It's a great starting point. Don't get me wrong. But what would be even better, in my opinion, to the next step, or I think what would be potentially seen in the future, um, they recently did a couple of years ago, or like a year or so ago, a text to material thing where they you could basically type in something and it will give you a complete material texture in Designer. But I think what would be even better if they want to take it to the next level is if you could type in a text like give me a node combination for making a base rock forms, and then it'll give you like the tile generators, the warps and all of that to start you off basically, because that's something that potentially you might struggle with. How do you start the base shape of something organic that's just so difficult to try and interpret? And obviously it just comes down to practice and just sometimes just experimenting. But I think that will be a big time saver in terms of finding ways to, yeah, cut down on time and just get cracking with the material. Because I think that's still one of the main bottlenecks, trying to take, 3 to 5 days to make a complete material is going to take a very long time to build an entire library for a full production game. So maybe this could be something that they could approach to ensure they can save time, basically. And how they go about this in terms of reading the SBS files so that the software knows is going to be very interesting. But I definitely see that in the next couple of years. If anything, I think that would be a quite good feature. I think it would potentially, maybe hinder the creativity of materials, learning them from scratch. But I think that's just the way things are going to move forward. You might still get some AIs that can actually build an entire material for you, but you'll still need to go in there yourself to piece things together, to change some parameters here and there. So you still have to have an understanding of what what certain nodes do what, basically. So it gives you the correct output, basically.
So two things would be that one, instead of attempting to, because some people are intimidated by AI and understandably so.
Mm,
So instead of running away from it, it's better to learn the AI and learn to incorporate it in your work so you can enhance your efficiency, your production speed, your quality. And second is that AI is not a shortcut to just labeling yourself as an artist. You still need to have your core concepts down. You still need to have a strong foundation and understanding of how materials are built, what are the color concepts, how textures work, how to add noise, and have all those basic concepts down so that if you do use AI, you can actually get the right output from it, as opposed to just trying to, shortcut your way to try and creating something without really understanding how things work.
yeah, absolutely. You definitely need to have some sort of foundation to know how things are built properly, so you can go in and fix them correctly. Because in the long run, maybe yes, you have to spend a bit longer at fixing it, but that's no different than you opening someone's file, cleaning it before you can actually start doing the work. So in that respect, you might be thinking, well, it's the same sort of principle if you think of it that way. You might not be the exact type of rock that I'm wanting, but it's given me enough to just make some quick adjustments and just build on top of that. So it might save you a couple of hours, which when you add them in the long run, like Avatar had over 300 materials. So if it took you 5 days, 3 to 5 days to build a material, that's almost 1,500 days. So that's 5 years of potential making materials. So if you can just save half a day per material, that can definitely build up. And in the long run, for a business, this saves time, i.e., it saves money. So I think they'll just say, yeah, go for it if it's gonna mean we can save time and money. So yeah,
Yeah, that's fantastic. We are now going to just get into the live demo. Um, so if you would like to share your screen,
yeah.
um, you could show us some cool techniques or features that you personally would use or you would like to showcase. Perhaps some common mistakes beginners make when they're starting with procedural textures.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. So let me know when you can see the screen.
just a moment. I can see it. I'm just gonna ask chat. Folks, please let me know if you can see the screen. Uh, um, just a moment. There is a slight lag in the live stream compared to the. Okay, cool. Folks can see it. That's
Okay.
fantastic. So we can get started.
So this is a simplified material that I made a couple of years ago. This is just a simple brick material that, again, this will probably serve a good foundation for one of the five materials that you could potentially do to showcase, look, I can make a man-made material. It's a brick. It's generic, like the military radio or the AK-47 that you see all over our station. But again, it's going to showcase good fundamentals of how you can build a good brick, and then you can build on top of that. So the first thing I'm going to showcase is the portal nodes. So you might not notice that there's not any major lines crossing over, of the frames. They're all kind of contained between each boxes. And if I select everything, you can see the dotted lines, how it would naturally look like. But because I've used the portal nodes, it's keeping everything nice and clean, and then I can build it in a certain way that I don't have to keep it in a linear fashion. I can just move things however I want, and it will still make sense, and it will just keep it as clean as you want. So let's look at how that works. So to actually build a portal node, all you've got to do is drag out one of these lines and then type in dot node, and then you'll get, just hide these panels, and you'll get this little dot with this two dots on the side. And on the far right here, you'll get the properties. So the first thing you can do is just give it a name. So in this case, I'm going to connect it to the base generation over here and just call this base generation. Okay, so now we've made the output of this mask. Okay, so now we can basically use this anywhere we want in the graph. So if I want to, let's say, plug it in over here, all I've got to do is go and type in dot node again. And then in here, where you've got import portal, you will see all of the dot node output nodes that you've basically generated, what that I've done in this material. So we're going to go and find base generation, and there it is. So now, if I highlight this, you can see how it's connected. So you can see which one it belongs to. And then all I have to do now is just go in here and then connect it like I would normally connect a node. And then if you double click on the smaller circles over here, it will show you the preview of that particular input and output. So it's a really good way to just keep things clean, basically. So this is probably something that I would do at the very end of the graph once I'm happy and finished with the material, just so I don't get bogged down into the terminology of making it clean for the sake of speed. So yeah, this is a simple brick that I made. So we'll look into detail, well, in brief detail, however much time we've got left, how we can go about it. So we can see the individual details of the bricks, the mortar. It's got some nice noise over here with some mortar bleeding through. So let's take a look. So most of the materials will start off with one of these nodes, the tile generator, because this will probably offer the foundation of your base surfaces. You can use other similar nodes like the tile sampler, but the main difference is that the tile generator is non-dependent on anything else. So I would recommend to use the tile generator more often than not because it's also cheaper. If you see the cost of these little numbers here, the green ones, the tile generator basically costs nothing compared to a tile sampler. So they pretty much offer the same flexibility of what you can do, but this has a lot more inputs to drive exactly how the parameters are driven. So actually see a lot of students work when I'm reviewing it that they use the tile sampler when they can get away with just using the tile generator, especially if it's for very, very simple patterns like so. So we start off with a simple X and Y mount. I'm actually using the base pattern of the brick that we have by default. So there's nothing more to it. You just play around with the pattern specific to give it some variation, and you can play around with the edge width over here. I give it a slight variation on scale to make it a little bit smaller, and then I play around with the position slightly to just offset them 0.5 so that you can basically see um, in relation to the reference. And one thing that you can do when it comes to making bricks, depending on what country you are from, you can actually find metrics for these bricks sizes. So if you're building a particular texture that is, let's say, 2 by 2 or 4 by 4 meters, you can define, if you find out the definition of the height of that brick, which I think in the UK it's about 8 centimeters, and then 1 centimeter or 2 centimeters for the mortar, so that puts it at 10. So if you have a 2 by 2 meter texture, you can use that metric of the brick to basically build something accurate that fits exactly into the proportions of that 2 by 2. And then if you're building it 1 by 1, it'll be half the size or half the amount of bricks. So that's one thing that could potentially be quite physically accurate if you wanna say that. And I think this could be something quite interesting that you can mention in potentially the NDR test that you might get. You can sometimes get the opportunity to write some notes of the material of what you've done, and you can say, okay, I found out that this material in the UK is X height, and I was able to add these kind of numbers. And it's just a little thing that I think it might impress them basically in the long run. So the first thing I do a tiny bit of slow blur on the material just to ever so slightly break it up. So if we look before and after, it's very, very subtle, but it just shifts the tiles a little bit to break them from being straight laser lines. I'll do a histogram scan so I can levels them essentially to create a tighter mask. Then I use something called the flood fill node, which is one of the more popular, well, probably one of the most popular nodes in Designer when it comes to texturing, because this gives you the flexibility of extracting very different data from your textures. So as long as the cells, i.e. the bricks, are not touching each other, each one of these will have a different color, which you can use for texturing, overlaying on top to give different depths to the surface. And you can also use something called flood filter gradient, which will create a random gradient per cell. So you can make some cells of those bricks, quite slanted to give it a look that is quite rough and old. So now I've got the base masks. I've also got this non-uniform that is starting to give the bevel profile of the shape. So again, this is just about paying attention to your reference. And what I would say when it comes to reference, try and work potentially from one key reference that you're just trying to build it from, and then use supporting elements from other references that allow you to add extra details. Could be micro details, could be texture variation, etc. So this is the main mask. Then I'll do a secondary slow blur just to further break it up. So it's all about thinking macro to micro in terms of designer, just like environment work. You start with a big block out, start with the big shapes, and then you move your way down. Okay. Then we're starting to add some of the macro features and details. So I'm using one of the most popular nodes, the Clouds 2, in combination with Slow Blur. Now, this node is really, really good, but if it's overused, it will definitely, someone who's experienced will be able to tell straight away that you've used Clouds 2. So there's different ways you can go about mitigating that particular look. You can blend it with different noises. So you can see here, I'm blending it with a much more fine result. Or what you can do, if you scale down the Clouds 2, so currently it's at 4K, but if you take it down to 1024 or 512, when you actually use it in combination with slow blur, because it's much more detailed, much more low res, it doesn't have as much high frequency noise. So if you look at before and after, you can see how much more noise it has compared to this one. So you can just purely focus on the macro things to start with. So definitely start working macro to macro early on, and don't worry about putting noise too early on. So we're overlaying a bit of noise at different stages. So I've got one that is 0.25, zero point 0.1, and this just blends with different noises. So I've got one that's quite macro, and then one that's quite micro. If we look briefly at the normal map, you'll be able to see this is very, very fine. whereas this one is a bit more, not as detailed basically. So it will give me different effects that I'm just going to layer them on. Okay, so we're overlaying these two together. I've got here the random grayscale. So we're overlaying this very, very subtly just to give a bit of different height to the bricks. Not too much, but hopefully enough that if you zoom out, you can just about see some subtle variation. Okay. Next, we're adding the gradient, which again is very, very subtle. And one of the things that I constantly do when I work in designer, I build a material in the first pass, and more often, sorry, more often than not, it's not going to be right. I'll probably have to go back 2 to 3 times and just adjust things, just to see it again, how it was at the beginning, and just adjust the parameters, the intensities accordingly. So I'm doing more further refinements, and it's just about layering your details onwards. So you can see I'm starting to do a bit more fine detailing on the edges, and then when I combine it with a different noise, it just overlays and reveals the chipped areas versus the non-chipped areas quite nicely. One aspect that I try and say as well to students is when you're blending, something over your height map or adding a simple noise, if I'm adding, let's say some tiny pock marks like you can see here, these little um, dots scattered about, try and always have something plugged into the opacity of your texture because nothing that's going to be subtracting or adding or multiplying will ever be at a constant opacity of 0.015 or zero point 0.5 or whatever it might be. Because nothing is perfect in real life. There will always be imperfections. So trying to overlay something that will offer different intensities is really highly recommended. So I've got the base surface over here with my macro details. So it's just a case now of starting to add more fine detail. Now, as you'll be working through your material, you actually might not see directly any difference when you're adding your details because the height map is just so, well, you can't really see the details that I'm really adding on. So you can either view it in the preview, directly in the 3D, or you can just plug in a height to normal map because the details, how they'll come across, will be much more evident. So you can see these are the clean bricks, but then I'm slowly starting to add a bit of fine noise over them. And then you can see quite clearly how the details affect it, basically. So if you don't see the results happening in your height map, most likely they're just very, very subtly there. Of course, you can increase them, but it's all about seeing it in context in the 3D render. And you just need to pay attention to what kind of details you have. What I like to do is to physically highlight what they are in the reference so I can exactly see how I'm going to be blending them. And quite often I just build them independently that I later add them in the graph. So here I've got my surface cracks. Okay, so I could potentially find them from one reference, add them, some at a later stage, but I'm not doing them potentially quite too early. I could just be doing them at any point. So again, that's one benefit that designer has. You can just build things, wherever you want in your own little world, and then add them whenever you basically want to in the chain. So trying to pay attention to kind of details you have and just see them in context, see what the result looks like in the 3D view. And yeah, that's basically how you'd go about it. These are the bricks, and then we're going to soon look at the mortar, which is from over here. So the mortar is probably a little bit more complicated, but it's just a case of depending on how you do it, you can either just do it from just overlaying a simple noise over the top, and you use a height blend where it will give you the mask that you're blending them. So if you take this is the mortar, these are the bricks. When you combine them together, you'll get a mask like so, like a pure white mask of the combination of the two. And this is great because you can use this mask to again blend the different textures or the different colors later on. So you can just build your colors of the bricks, build the colors for the mortar, and then you just use this mask to combine the two together without any effort. And then it's basically done. And then you can add the next stage. So yeah, this is basically the way I structure things when it comes to designer. It of course varies per material, but this is an example of what we potentially be looking at when it comes to the course.
Uh, that was fantastic. That went over the general workflow That's given us a good feel. You've gone over some common mistakes that people might make when they're first starting out. If there are any questions, folks, just drop them in the chat. Just gonna wait for a second just to see if anyone has any questions still coming in. Um, and if not, if everyone's good, then okay. That seems like that's everyone's nobody has questions. That's great. Okay, so that was fantastic. I hope everyone who tuned in enjoyed and found this very interesting. And I'm just gonna drop how long do you guys have? If you have questions, I think we can, would you be able to spare out a few more minutes of
Yeah,
your
yeah,
time?
yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, cool. Guys, we have a few more minutes, so if you have questions that you want to ask, just drop them in the chat and we'll get them answered. Okay, I'm just gonna wait for just a minute just to let people drop their questions in. Uh, okay, since you can't see, they're just saying thanks and it was really good. Thanks for demonstrating. Um, okay. Uh, sorry, but this was very complicated for a beginner. Uh, would you have, would you be able to show making a new material from scratch? Because we have some folks saying that they would like to see that, like down to the very basics.
Yeah, yeah, let's do that. Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna share screen again. Guys, let me know if you can see. Okay, so they want to know how to start from a clean slate,
Okay.
like from the very basics. So let us know once you can see the screen. Um, I'm just going to quickly drop just a link in the chat. Uh, this is just for folks. I'm just going to put this up. Okay, very nice. A 5 minutes brief would help. We can use the same material. Can see the screen. Okay, yeah, let's get
Yep.
started then.
Okay, so you've just opened Designer, you've had a splash screen, and the first thing you'll want to do, let me close all. Yeah.
Oh, just a
Okay.
moment. Sorry, guys. Can you see the screen? The screen is all clear. I'm not sure. Does that mean you cannot see the screen or? Okay, the screen is all clear, like as in the window is all clear because that's he's starting from scratch. So, uh, okay, I'm just gonna wait for a quick response. Okay, everyone can see the screen. Just so you know, the window is clean because we are starting from scratch. Okay,
Okay.
yeah, sorry for about that.
So you've just opened Designer, and the first thing you'll do is go to File, New, and then Substance Graph. And then you get the UI panel for basically the type of material you have. What I will suggest is just start with a simple metallic rough because this will give you the foundation for the textures that you potentially use in Designer. And you will export in the engine. Click OK. Make sure you save, and then you'll get these bunch of nodes. So you'll get the far ones here on the right. These are the output nodes where you'll be physically seeing stuff in the 3D view and what you're going to export. And then here on the left, you've got the input nodes that are just the base nodes to give you a basic preview of the sphere. So if I was to delete this one, it will be black because there's not an occlusion. So let's look at making a simple brick. What I'll start with is if you hit space or tab, it will bring up the search panel for the node list. And you just start typing, and I'm going to type for tile generator grayscale, which is going to give us the basic foundation of the bricks. So what I'm going to do first is just hide all of this and then go into the position and just play around with the different amounts of the material. So I'm just going to go for the same amount, 10 to 24. Go into the pattern over here, which will define what kind of shape you want to use. You can use square, disc, whatever you want. And thankfully, we've actually got a brick, so we can use that. So I'm going to bring down the pattern specific, which is just going to lower the intensity of the edges slightly, and then play around a little bit with the variation, just to make them a little bit more organic, because they're not all going to be the same. Next thing, I'm going to switch down to the position and just going to do a simple offset to 0.5. Okay, just leave it like that. So it's nice and uniformly in the middle, everything's nicely laid out. And then now we can start overlaying some details. So we're going to do a simple non-uniform blur, which again, if you hit space or tab, it brings you the properties panel. And this is just a specific node in Unreal, in Designer, that lets you add a bit of a blur to the texture. So you can see it gives us a bit more of a profile onto the shape of the brick. So it just gives it a tiny bit more roundness into the material. To actually start seeing this stuff in the 3D view, all you've got to do is, again, type in height to normal, or use the base normal node that you have over here. Combine these two, and then there you go. You've got the base bricks in 3D render. So now we can see exactly what they look like. So now you can just move these out of the way, like so. Move them a bit back so you can just add stuff along the chain and see them exactly how they should be. What you can also do, if you hold Control and then drag from one of these points, you'll get another line of the chain. So what you can do now is right click, add node, and then you can get a list of various different nodes. But what we can do is, again, go to the tab and type in HBAO, which is going to give us the ambient occlusion node. So let's connect this. So we get the proper ambient occlusion for the texture. So we're going to use the world units, which is going to allow us to define the size of the texture and how much depth the material has. With bricks, they're very, very flat. So you can see here, we've got a depth of 30 centimeters. So if you've got like a regular ruler, you'll know that that's too much. So we're just going to input here. Let's go for 2. There you go. I'm going to use that. Drag this in. So now we can see we've got ambient occlusion in the cavities. Let's just replace this. Now we can start adding some more details. So I'm going to add a bit of detail onto the bricks, break them up a little bit so they're not so laser line in terms of look. And I'm going to add a purlin noise, which is just a very, very simple noise to start breaking them up. So you can see by the default, they look like that, which is not what we want. Bring down the intensity to something very, very subtle, and then change the mode to min. And now if you play around with the slider for the intensity, you can see now the details are only affecting the cells or the bricks inwards. If I go back on blur, you can see that they bleed on top of each other, which we don't want. And the same goes for max. So min is the mode that we want. So I'm going to go for 0.25. We've got a bit of definition on these. Cool. So we've got the macro details. Let's add another slow blur. And then now add a clouds 2, just to start adding some detail. Okay, again, increase the samples, which will affect the quality. Bring down the intensity. Again, something very, very subtle, maybe even more subtle than that. Okay. So we start to get some details. We start to get some nice chipping. You can see we've still got some nice sharp edges on the bricks, which is something you potentially want. You don't want to overdo the amount of noise. But for the sake of it, let's go do another one at a micro level. So we've got our third slope, and then we're going to do a black and white spots. So if you see the comparison between the three, Perlin is super macro, clouds 2 more micro detail or medium details, and then black and white spots, it's super detailed and noisy. So again, we'll combine this together, bring down the intensity, and as you'll have more high frequency noises, you'll have to lower the intensity of various different nodes to keep them in line. So you can see how much detail this has compared to the clouds 2. And that's obviously way too much in this case. Let's bring it even further, just to get very tiny, minute details. And again, if you look at the norm map, if you hold shift and then click on a node, you'll get this ability to reconnect it. So if you just click and drag to the final one, it will swap it to the final node basically. So instead of doing it by hand, like that and that, you can just use Shift. So now we can see how the detailing looks on the bricks. Cool, that's looking nice. Let's add a bit of detail on the actual tile so that it's not so flat and crisp. So we're going to add a transform 2D to make the black and white spots just tile ever so more because it's a bit too, you can see the individual details of the cells and just the noise. So if I make this tile a little bit, it would be definitely be more micro. And I'm just going to do a simple blend. Okay. You can play around the intensity with the blending modes, but I like to use multiply or copy and then bring down the intensity of the material. And then when we see the result, you're starting to get a bit of that surface definition on the black and white spots. But if I bump it up slightly, now we've got intensity happening everywhere at 0.1, basically at the same value, which is not something what we want. So what we can do is plug something in the opacity, and I'm just going to use this clouds too. And you'll hopefully see that if I go between and after, let me increase the intensities to actually see it more clearly. But if I delete this, you can see that now everything is consistent on the same intensity, but then now it happens, at different states. This one's got a bit more, this one's got a bit less, etc. Cool. So now we've got some base surface detail on the bricks. Okay, so now we can start adding, more individual details from our reference. So we could potentially add some chipware, some dirt that will simulate a bit of just more defined details. Pardon me. So we're just going to take this dirt too, combine them together, and then use a subtract. So obviously at 100% is way too much. If you put them, you can see that the intensity of them, it's way too aggressive. So we want to pull that back. Okay, bring that more in line, probably 0.15. And then again, if you plug in a texture in the opacity, it would just behave a bit more natural. Cool, let's go for that. So again, the other thing that you can do to keep your graph nice and clean, you can see that these lines cross over and it can be difficult sometimes to know where things are what. So if you hold Alt and then hover over a line, you get this little yellow circle that moves along it. Now this is a reroute node. So you can just add a node, or essentially a dot node, to drag the line around to keep it more clean. And you can add as many as you want, basically. Okay, so we're going to bring these two down just so we can clearly see where everything is. Okay, now let's add the mortar. So we're going to do a fractal sum base, which is just going to give us a very soft detail on the noise. But as it is, it's way too high frequency, so we need to clamp it down, because if we just do a simple height blend to combine the two together, so the mortar is going to go at the bottom and then the bricks on the top. We want to bump up the contrast to make sure we've got black and white edges. It can sometimes give us a funny looking border. Okay. So if you notice around here, you get a bit of a weird intersecting line. So if you increase the contrast, it will fix that for you. So at this point, you can just play around with the offset to make the mortar go over the bricks or go below, and it's completely down to you. So you can see now the mortar is going over the bricks from the center, which is potentially not what we want. So this is where you use the mask that you can generate from the bricks to overlay in between. So you could do something like a simple levels to just clamp the mask like so. I would invert it, do a simple blur. And I would probably want to add it on top of the base noise. which is the simple screen. So a lot of the blend modes are very similar to Painter and Photoshop, but I do wish that they would add all of the blend modes that they have in Photoshop and Painter, because there's some really cool stuff there that you don't really have um, access to, which is a shame. We're going to clamp down the base noise with the levels, or you can use a histogram range, but we're going to use the levels for this. We're going to use the bottom two sliders to just bring it down so it's more flat in the gray value, like so. And then when we combine them, hopefully it can give us the result that we want. So now we've got a bit more control over where that mortar line sits between the two. So you can get some really cool effect where the mortar can look like it's bleeding over tiles. If you've got like a nexus of mortar or it's quite clean and flat, this is one approach of doing it. So let's say we've got the base height map done. Okay, now let's just do the base color. Now the base color is going to be fairly simple because we've already got the mortar, we've got the bricks, and we've got a mask. So all we've got to do is really just find ways to color it basically. So what we're going to do is take two uniform colors, which is just a base flat color, almost like the fill bucket or the fill layer in Painter. And you can use whatever color you want. So I'm going to start off with a simple orange, maybe make it a little bit lighter. So you've got the properties for the hue, saturation, and the value. The value is going to control the intensity or the opacity, should I say, of this. Bring down the saturation. And I'm going to make a second one of this, and then make it a little bit more red, like so. I'm going to take a blend node, combine these two together, and you obviously need to have something in the opacity because currently it's 100% one or the other. So we're just going to use the height map like so. So you could potentially throw some noise over here to add a bit more detail, but this will act as fine for the foundation. So this could be the base color. We're going to blend now the mortar, which for us is just going to be a simple flat color. So we're going to make it just a simple gray so they can stand out. And we're going to plug in the height mask of the two. So you might get this, which is obviously wrong. So if you just select the two lines and then hit X, you'll invert them. Okay. Next, we're going to add a bit of detail over the textures because it's just quite flat. There's not much detail going on. So we're going to take the dirt node, which is one of my favorite nodes in Designer, because this will add a lot of context to the material. It will add a lot of dirt in the cavities and to the edges. So for this, we need two things. We need the ambient occlusion and the curvature. We've already got the ambient occlusion because we've already done that at the beginning. So we're just going to plug that in. The curvature is defined from the nom map. So we just need to add the curvature node. I like to use the curvature smooth because it gives a wider range of gradients. If we look at the default one, they're much more sharp and more micro level and more noisy, which will probably be fine, but I prefer to use the smooth version. So if we plug these two together, you get this. So we know that this is going to be too intense. We're going to bring down the dirt level way down and then increase the grunge amount. Okay, something more like that. And then now we can just overlay this dirt on top. And then we can just use another flat color. So let's make it more like a dirty grayish brown, potentially like that. So there you go. Now you can hopefully see there's a bit more context to the surface, but we don't want 100% on the intensity. We want to pull this back a little bit to make it a little bit softer so we can just keep adjusting things. And then one of the final things I'll do, I like to overlay the curvature details over the base color. Because the curvature has so many intricate details in its edges, cavities, etc., it'll be a shame not to use it. So to do that, you'd think that you can just plug in, the curvature directly like so. Well, that doesn't work because the background is a color mode and you can tell by the orange line, whereas the opacity for the previous nodes are grayscale and they are gray. So if you combine the two together like that, you get a red line, which is obviously gonna not work. So to fix that, we want to add a gradient map, connect the curvature to it to make the blend node think that this is a color, basically, but we're not actually adding any color. And we're just going to combine the two, and then we're going to use a soft light. And then if you've done everything right, you should get a little bit more definition on the highlights and the cavities of the material. So the dirt already gives us plenty of that. So we maybe want to pull the back on the detail from here. And this is where I was saying before, you'll be going back and forth to adjust these intensities. Okay, I like to use soft light for when I overlay the curvature because it just gives it's not overly too strong on the material. And this could be the base foundation for your bricks, basically. So we're just going to plug this in into the output. So now we can see that obviously the bricks are shiny, which is wrong, unless they are. They could be wet because it could have just rained, depending on your reference. So to build the roughness, one of the first things I do, I convert the color map to grayscale because there's so much good information in the range of colors that you can use this as a foundation. So something you can do if you're pressed for time or the reference denotes that the material is just generally very, very rough. You don't need to have a complex roughness map. You could just use something quite simple where you can take the grayscale version, invert it. So you've got it quite rough and matte, and this could be potentially the base plate. I would then add the dirt just to add a bit more definition and details. The dirt, it depends on the reference that you've got. It could have a lot of shiny and matte details, but what I like to do is to use one of the nodes in the graph. So I'm going to take this clouds 2 again and then plug this into the opacity. But what I'm going to do beforehand, you can see it gives us the result, which is wrong. I'm going to take the dirt texture and then the clouds 2, select the two lines, and then hit X, and it will invert them. So now we've got some nice dirt variation in the cavities. That's going to be shiny and matte, basically. But what you don't want to do is to have a lot of shiny details in cavities because naturally they don't really happen unless a lot of moisture or rain gets in there. So one of the final things I like to do is to overlay the ambient occlusion over the top because the ambient occlusion will have those cavity details. When you overlay them, it will make them rough. So for that, we're going to take the invert node, connect it to the ambient occlusion, which will give us the invert version operation, add it on top, and then choose screen, either screen or add. I think in this case, add is a bit overkill. So we're going to go for screen. So we still get a bit of details come through quite nicely. And then we're going to plug this into the roughness. You can see it's a bit flat, but let's bump up the intensity of the norm map. So now we've got a bit more detail and definition come through, and it's just a case of going back to adjust accordingly. So I'm going to bring back the details over here, maybe add a bit of variation on the bricks. So what you can do, if you take a flood fill from one of these nodes, so let's make a black and white mask of the material. So depending on where and how much detail you add, the flood fill requires a lot of white data to work properly. So where you've got all this grayscale range over here, it's not going to be able to give you a full extent of that. So you can see here, hopefully, if I go before and after, it's missing a lot of detail, especially around the corners over here. So what you can do is you can try and make a mask out of this. So I'm going to use a histogram scan, or you can use the levels, which will work exactly like in Photoshop. And you just try and get as tight as possible, making sure that you avoid them intersecting each other. Because if you get them combined, so if you get them something like that, basically, you can see that these two are touching each other by these 1 or 2 pixels. Now it's going to assume that this is one single cell. And then when you convert that data to use for texturing, it will be the same color, basically. So what you want to do is to make sure you've got each individual edge separate. So you just need to play around with the mask basically as close as possible. And then now we've got individual data. So you can just double check, make sure it's all looking exactly as it should be. And now you've got the individual cells colors. You can just overlay these on top. So we're going to make a random, a graded map. And you can either use this to sample from your reference, or you can just overlay this directly on the top. So I'm just going to use a simple multiply, bring this down, and there you go. I've got a bit of variation on the bricks. So they're not all the same color. If you're doing like a new build house where all the bricks are exactly the same, you wouldn't want to have a lot of variation. But if you're doing something quite, worn, dirty, very, very aged, you want to add plenty of details and variation. So this is just one approach of doing it. There's different ways of tackling this. It's just one of the ways that we're going to potentially be looking at in the course.
Okay, that was great. I hope that gets some questions answered, and I hope that clarifies a lot of stuff. That was very interesting and that was very helpful. Um, so that is all the time that we have today. So I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Thanks for joining us, Stefan. It was a pleasure. And I'm just gonna drop a link in the chat, guys. You can check that link out. That is the course that Stefan will be teaching. And you can just sign up for the wait list if you're interested. You can take a look at it and see if it piques your interest. Um, Thanks for tuning in, guys. That was an absolute pleasure and that was a real treat. Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
thanks
Thank
for
you,
having me.
Stefan. It was a pleasure. Okay, with that being said, yeah, that's all. Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back soon with a new episode. So